So, your work emphasizes the importance of authenticity and attunement to self and others. Could you speak to how men can better develop this awareness and why it's so crucial for their psychological growth?
Yeah. It's not easy being a man. It isn't. In a way, it's not easy being a person. There's a lot of drives and instincts that come up through us that we need to manage. And we also need to manage our sense of who we are, our own sense of personal identity. And in general, what I've found with men is that they need to occupy some version of acolyte into warrior, into man of wisdom. They need to feel themselves on that in some fashion. I think this goes back to the very beginning. 5 million years ago, when we came down out of the trees, what distinguished humans from other animals was the pair bond, the family. You know, a woman needed a guy to protect her and her kids. She couldn't just jump into the trees like chimpanzees could with their kids. And around those families, the ancestral tribes developed. And in those families were hierarchies. And in those hierarchies were men and women in charge and kids. And they were either dominator hierarchies where people were pushing each other around, or growth hierarchies where they were helping each other grow. And to this day, every human institution has those. And if you're a guy, there's a part of you that wants to experience yourself as the person who would stand between a threat and your tribe, between a threat and your family. And part of that runs off of your sense of being true to your own values. We're all born with at least 6 moral foundations in place that get structured by culture. And this is where it gets tricky in the modern age. Up until around a couple hundred years ago, there were roles that were provided for people as they were born into tribes and into societies. With the liberation movements 200 years ago and technological revolution, evolution accelerated. And now every generation has to rediscover the archetypes of the warrior and the man of wisdom. Now every new generation has to rediscover and reconstruct what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to live a virtuous life? And how do you live a life where you feel consistent with your values and feel like you're contributing in the way that you want to contribute? Generally, that is what constitutes a happy and healthy life. And so for a guy, authenticity, integrity, open-heartedness, radical acceptance, these qualities, as you cultivate them, tend to make you feel consistent with those values of acolyte to warrior to man of wisdom. And those ancestral voices, those drives, those instincts, they go, okay, I'm now there in the way that is available to me in this age. In this age, we have so many choices. It's difficult to choose, but whatever we choose, if we're a more masculine person, we need to be true to our heart. And that means being willing to stand up for our principles, our values, in the face of adversity. And that's what characterizes the warrior, that capacity. And if people continue to grow in that capacity, they tend to evolve into the man of wisdom. Now, how do we do it? There's a lot of different ways, but mostly pay attention to yourself and to other people. And you get a lot of feedback from yourself and from the world. For instance, attunement. So attunement, and we can all do it right now, is being aware of your breath with acceptance and caring intent. Be aware of emotion with acceptance and caring intent. Now be aware of thought. Thought comes in and out of your consciousness. You don't follow thoughts necessarily, but be aware of them. Be aware of a judgment at this point as you're aware of breath and sensation and emotion. We judge all the time. We can't help but judge. We judge in multiple dimensions all the time. Is something real or not real, true or not true? Is something moral or not moral? Is something attractive or unattractive? Be aware of your judgments with acceptance and caring intent. And then be aware of desire. Is there something you want at this moment? As you do that, you begin to develop a series of sense organs of tuning into your body, tuning into your sensation. And this is how our unconscious speaks to us through sensation, through image, through emotion, through impulse. And if we're aware with acceptance and caring intent, we're practicing the witness. You know, all contemplative practices involve self-awareness, self-observation. And productive self-awareness is the centerpiece of every change system, every psychotherapeutic system. Some people have more skills in this area than others, but you can cultivate it by this practice. Now, as you look at me, I wonder what Keith is sensing with acceptance and caring intent, feeling, thinking, judging, wanting. I wonder what Keith's, and now you're attuning to me. As we do this, we as an ultra-social species, we're the only mammalian ultra-social species. By ultra-social, I mean like ants, like Two chimpanzees can't pick up a log together to get grubs underneath that log. Human beings can self-organize and make skyscrapers and super yachts, ultra social. And to be able to do that, we have all these resonance circuits to attune to each other. And we have the most expressive face in the animal kingdom. And we have mirror neurons in our hearts entrain each other when we're talking. There's numerous sense organs and communication that goes back and forth. So that a practice of attunement guides us, because as we're aware of ourselves and other people with acceptance and caring intent, we're aware of when things are going well and when things are going badly. And if things are going badly and we're aware of it with integrity and with authenticity, we'll take responsibility for our part of it and change. And that's productive self-awareness. And productive self-awareness is what leads us to personal evolution. And as men, generally we evolve from boy to acolyte to warrior to man of wisdom. You know, kids just be kids. We play, we hang out, we do the things that see excited. At some point or another, a kid goes, there's something I want to do that's real. I don't want to play pretend violin. I want a real violin. I don't want to play pretend swords. I want a real sword. I don't want to play, pretend whatever. Okay, I want to do the real thing. And they'll choose something and then get wise teachers if their culture helps them, and they'll grow. And that's the acolyte. And there's data, fascinating data from high school. The SAT people wanted to know what predicted success after college. So they looked at 100 variables. Well, to their disappointment, SAT scores didn't predict success after college. Only the thing that predicted success after college more than anything else was somebody in high school having a couple of years of pursuing something that they wanted to master, that they were studying. That capacity, being the acolyte, engaged in something that you want to master, changed them in a positive way, enough so that 6, 7, 8 years later, they were more successful. Now, what the warrior is as you learn, as you develop mastery in an area, you're challenged. And those challenges are ordeals. You know, you run into your block. If you've ever seen George Leonard's work on the mastery curve, generally, if you work on something, you make pretty rapid progress, plateau out, do a lot of effort, but nothing seems to change. Even if you have a master coach, which, is a good thing. There's a great book on that called The Talent Code. And then there'll be a little dip, and then there'll be another up-leveling. To be able to sustain yourself through that time, that requires commitment and focus and integrity. Conscientiousness predicts success more than anything else. Interesting, entitlement predicts failure more than anything else. People that don't believe that they have to try, they have to work. And so that's the warrior. The warrior runs into problems and issues and these ordeals, meeting them, the successes and failures, you discover parts of yourself. And so that's why we seek out ordeals, marathons, triathlons, degrees. We take that on. And as we take it on and we meet those ordeals and we get through them, we discover ourselves and we grow. And if you do that throughout a lifetime, and we have now an extra lifetime, about 100 years ago, everybody got an extra lifetime because of modern science. The life expectancy went up 30 years. As we progress, at some point, we don't want to struggle anymore. We don't want to seek out ordeals. We want to share and we want to care and we want to help guide other people and contribute. And that's man of wisdom. And men who are true to that tend to feel good about themselves as men, and they tend to be trustable to other men and women. And so that's how it works. And it's complex, it's complicated, it's challenging, it's very difficult to be a human being. And yet here we are.
Here we are. And I appreciate that comprehensive and robust framework that will help us understand what seems to be the innate and natural journey of every man. A few questions within that framework. So the first would be, what are some traits of each one in a modern day context that a guy could understand where he's at? My understanding of this, obviously there's some developmental factors here where, you're not a 80-year-old acolyte, but at the same time, psychologically, we seem to be finding more and more men get to an age where they are technically mature, but are actually very stunted. So I'm curious how a guy can understand what traits lie in each of those. And then over your years of work, as you've seen culture shift, have you seen maybe the definitions or resonance within each of those types change over the years? For instance, 30 years ago, did a warrior look like this and now it looks like this, or is it the same?
So it's never the same. Evolution changes and evolution is accelerating. One thing that helps is that we have access now to tools of self-discovery that weren't available to previous generations. The idea of an unconscious, the idea of adult development are relatively recent ideas. Now, up until the 60s, developmentalists thought that development kind of stopped after 26 when your brain became mature. We all know that that's wildly inaccurate. So one of the tools is understanding masculine and feminine. And I got most of this from David Data, who's really a superior teacher about this. I studied with him, studied his stuff and wrote about his stuff a lot in the 25, 30 years ago. All of us have masculine and feminine aspects because we're humans and we contain multitudes. All of us are, there's meaning at the edge of death. There's emptiness. There's philosophy. There's words. There's presence. There's integrity. There's personal honor. There's being loved through the body. There's light, open channels of emotion, family, dance, color, texture. Now you notice I didn't tell you which set was masculine or feminine. It's obvious. We all have masculine and feminine aspects. In the sexual occasion, we're more often the leader of the dance, the masculine, opening our partner up and being nourished by their pleasure, or the follower in the dance, the feminine, following trustable direction and being open up to deeper pleasure. If you have a more masculine sexual essence, you have a hunger to embody the warrior archetype. And that means identifying your values and being true to them. Now, the reason why I started with this is that, again, up until about 100 years ago, everybody were told how to be. We were told how to be a man, told how to be a woman. To this day, it's very difficult to discern through young adulthood what motivations you have that are coming from the culture or are coming from your own innate desires. For instance, American culture says you're supposed to like travel. I didn't realize until I was in my 30s that I didn't like to travel much. I traveled to teach. I traveled to see my family. Besides that, I'm not that interested. And I was surprised. I went, whoa, I thought I liked travel. Well, that's because the culture told me I was supposed to like it and so on. But now in this age where we can be individuals, we can discover who we are. There's more than, male, female genders, heterosexual, homosexual. There's like 50 genders. Who am I? Well, you got room to be yourself. But to do that, you need self-awareness, attunement to yourself and to other people. And the archetypes change. When I was a kid, it was John Wayne, suck it up, carry on, James Bond, be promiscuous, Dirty Harry, be an anarchist. These were the masculine. And there was something about them that was appealing to each one of them because there was power there. And there was a masculine essence, but there were blind spots. And the blind spots of vulnerability, the blind spots of self-awareness, the blind spots of following rather than always leading, the blind spots of never inappropriate violence. And so those archetypes, in 1965, I was 15, they weren't satisfying for me. And through a series of events, I went, okay, I need to make a decision about how I want to live my life. And the only archetypes that attracted me in 1965 were the warrior and the healer. But there weren't any forms of them that were particularly attractive other than psychologists and martial artists. And so for me, that led me forward into being a psychologist and martial artist. And that was the path that I chose. Now, as I did that, I discovered ordeals that I had to meet, discovered myself in them. There were values that I discovered. I began to discover, who am I, that unique person? And how does that fit into the masculine? How does that fit into being a unique person, but still being true to my values? Still not allowing violence not in my presence. Still being willing to endure discomfort in service of what's right. That kind of stuff. And so that's how it worked through the 60s and 70s and so on. And what I've observed is every generation has had to come up with their own ideas, their own definitions of what's masculine, what's feminine, what's man and woman, but still there's these through lines. The through line for a guy is be true to your values. And sometimes that you find out about that is you violate a value and feel ashamed. One of my books is called The Gift of Shame. And I wrote that because shame is a misunderstood emotion and it's necessary developmentally and it guides us. Because if I'm ashamed of something, I'm violating a value and I should either follow that value or refine it, change it. And in this hyper individualistic culture that we have in the West, 100% responsible for ourselves. So how do we do it? Do it by productive self-awareness, do it by asking other people and receiving influence from them. Do it by understanding that we evolve personally throughout a lifetime, choosing paths that seem important to us, whatever it is. And if it's something that's larger than us, then it feels sacred. You feel like we're on a mission. And the masculine wants deep soul's purpose, craves it. And I don't think that it can be just gratification. There's been things that have really excited me over the years that I wanted to learn how to do. Different martial arts, tap dancing at one point. I wanted to learn how to surf, learned how to surf. But something service, being a psychotherapist, being a teacher, there was something larger. It wasn't recreational. It was something more sacred. And that's led my development. And most guys have something like that, something sacred to them. And if they don't have it, they suffer. And that suffering is important, that distress at not having purpose. Pay attention to that suffering, and then pay attention to yourself moving through the world. And then all of a sudden the suffering is gone. What am I doing? Maybe this thing that I'm doing is connected to deep soul's purpose. And that's valuable. It's valuable to discover that.
Yeah, it is. Oh, I appreciate you providing those insights and a few things that struck me. The first was, although you were given a cultural blueprint for stereotypically what it meant to be a man, you accepted that while there was some conditioning there, you didn't have to fully abide by it, and you were able to find different ways of expressing that with what was around you, that you didn't have to live helplessly. And now it's, or has been called, the man box, right? Of what we see as this is what it means to be a man. So I appreciate you doing that. And for any guys listening, there's always something near you that you can look to and grab. If you search, you will find it. The second thing is your comment about how when a man violates a set of values, then he feels the shame. I agree with that. I love acceptance commitment therapy, which I'm sure you're aware of, which takes that sense of, okay, what are your values? What do you care about? And how does it apply to your life? That feels so helpful in a world that can't agree on morals and ethics, and we're all over the place on how we interpret things. And because of the internet, everyone seems to have an opinion. And I think the values is so important because, like you said, you're given a set that are true to you that you should be able to name what we would call core values. So I think that's the first step in that awareness you mentioned at the beginning. Be aware, what are my 3 to 5 core values that drive the majority of my decisions? Doesn't mean all of the decisions, of course. And then pay attention whenever you feel inauthentic, weak, small, ashamed, belittled, disconnected. There's a good chance you've probably violated one of those values. And my sense of it is, I'm curious how you would recommend someone to go about this, is after you name the values and you pay attention to them, it seems to be a refinement period where you find how integrated you are in living them. Okay, I might say this is a value now that I've named it, but I like to distinguish the difference between aspirational and lived values. You may say you care about this. Your mom might have told you to care about this. The news maybe said to care about this, but what is your actually life, your behaviors, your actions show within that?
Yeah, I agree with all that. That makes really good sense. I think it's true. My particular path was in 1965. Nothing attracted me. The way that I kind of discovered all this is I had a psychotic episode. My family was all blowing up, and they committed me. And I had electroshock treatment. I had 23 of them. Yeah, quite a surprise. It was so I was in that hospital. Had a clinical depression, psychotic depression. Electroshock confuses you, but you're not depressed. Believe it or not. And I looked around in that culture, 1965, Vietnam, Nixon, all the assassinations. I don't really like any of it, except warrior and healer. And there's a couple of things developmentally that are super important. One, between the ages of 15 and 20, the hunger for spiritual connectedness doubles. Yeah, Judith Miller did this research. Apparently, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's when we really discover our connection with the other world, the spirit. And also, humans have what's called a model imperative. Joseph Chilton Pearce wrote about this. We see where we want to grow in other people. I mean, for instance, if a child is not shown people walking, they saw this with feral children who were raised by wolves. They don't learn how to walk. Now, so you have to see people. You have to hear people talking to learn how to talk. You have to see people walking, learn how to walk. You need to be in a social environment where people are treating each other fairly to learn about fairness. You have the desire to have it, but the form of it isn't there until you see a model. It's called the model imperative. And for me, there were a couple of models that my unconscious chose. One was Susumu Oshima, the head of the Shotokan of America. And the other one was my therapist, the psychologist that my family chose, Joe Erickson. And a couple of interesting things happened with that. 30 years later, my wife and I went and had lunch with Joe Erickson. And after about 5 minutes, we all kind of got spooked out because he and I had the same smile. We had the same laugh. Some part of my unconscious had followed and used him as a model of how to be. When my son was 17, I took him to have tea with Mr. Oshima, who was around. And every 5 or 10 minutes, Mr. Oshima was talking. My son would say, my dad always says that. My dad always says that. So we choose people to grow towards. And values are not completely relativistic. I believe it's wrong to objectify another person and then use them and then do damage to them for gratification or reward. I think that's a universal. I find that offensive, morally offensive. It violates a lot of my kind of core foundations and the foundation values that people have had. Jonathan Haidt's done this research. People want things to be fair. They want people to care for each other. They think loyalty is better than disloyalty. They think respect for appropriate authority is better than subversion. They think you should respect what's sacred to other people's sanctity. They believe that freedom is better than oppression. And so we're born with these, and then we discover forms of them, and then we discover our own individual take on those things. Some cultures, particularly modern culture, if you look at it these days, do objectify and attack other people for profit, gratification, that kind of stuff. In an extreme sense, that's called mass formation psychosis. Desmay wrote about that in The Psychology of Authoritarianism. In individualistic the West, health rapidly becomes, as you develop, being 100% responsible for everything you experience or do. Now, think about what that means. If I'm 100% responsible for everything I experience and do, that means that the ultimate moral authority is in my heart. Now, a guy who really pays attention to that and trusts that, whatever that is, there's a peacefulness around that man that can be felt by other people. You can feel it in me as I'm talking. It's a hard-fought capacity. There's a lot of challenges and seductions, distractions, and mistakes that we all make developmentally. And so the through line around that stuff, for me, is the warrior. Now, from a martial arts standpoint, people think about, like Bruce Lee and stuff, which is not bad. I mean, this guy's a great fighter. When I was 30, I was studying martial arts and healing with a Taoist priest. And he gave me a copy of Miyamoto Musashi's book, A Book of Five Ranks. Miyamoto Musashi was the preeminent samurai warrior of 17th century Japan. Now, if you know anything about history, you know that the samurai warriors in 17th century Japan were the meanest motherfuckers in the world ever. In terms of one-on-one combat, they were the best that had ever existed, probably before and since. And he was the preeminent warrior in Japan during this time. When he was 60, he went to the cave and he wrote a book called A Book of Five Ranks. And I got a copy of it to overlook from John Davidson, the Taoist priest I was studying with. It blew my mind and guided me, and it continues to guide me. Miyamoto said, the way of the warrior, the first thing, the way of the warrior is a resolute acceptance of death, which means resolute acceptance of everything. So if something's already happened, don't whine and complain about it. Deal with it. Resolute acceptance. He said, do not think dishonestly. So that's radical attunement to what I'm feeling, what I'm doing. He says, have intuitive judgment about everything. Don't resign from the fact that you're having to evaluate the world. He said, a warrior should not let his spirit get too high or too low. One of my favorites is he said, learn the 5 sword attitudes and then forget the 5 sword attitudes. Just think about cutting your opponent, which in psychotherapy means learn a bunch of therapies and then forget about a bunch of therapies to just think about helping your client in the moment. And then the very end, the Book of the Void, which is the last book, he says, in the void is virtue and no evil. Wisdom has existence. Principle has existence. The way has existence. Spirit is no thingness. And those qualities are qualities that I aspire to every day. And for me, that led me into the warrior man of wisdom. But as I taught and did therapy and did groups and so on, realized all men had their own way of moving through that sequence. But what was through line? Through line, if you have more masculine essence, you need to be respectful of your values and true to them. And when you suffer not from violating them, take that suffering seriously and now correct and begin to follow your values. And when men did that, and when men do that, they tend to thrive. And that's beautiful. And every generation has some version of that. And the current generation has their version of it. And I find all the versions beautiful. And I support everybody following that. Everyone that has a more masculine essence. If you have a more feminine essence, I think that there's different paths to get to woman of wisdom. I think you can take the warrior path to woman of wisdom, but you can also take the artist path or the dancer part or the divine lover or the divine mother. I've observed that with the women I've worked with over the years. I mean, men and women are not the same. They're different.
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing in a more rare resource in that Japanese samurai. I think upon first hearing that title, like you're saying, not the kind of guy you think would write a book like that. And yet it provided a deep wisdom and resonance with you that sent you on a journey of seeing life as a man differently. Interesting enough, from someone who had the most power to be violent and to destroy, and yet chose to channel that, integrate it, and transcend it to provide a nonviolent, wise, grounded way of being. And we'll put that book in the show notes. You've mentioned several times about masculine essence and the deep soul's purpose. Many men seem to be drawn to David Dita's framework because it does avoid wishy-washy language often found in discussions of masculinity. Even thinking about that book you just mentioned, how direct and confident he spoke without this sense of certainty. This is the only way to see things. It's more of, hey, this is my sense of how things are. I'm curious, can you elaborate on what makes this approach that Dita offers so deeply resonant with men, including yourself?
One thing that happened from an evolutionary standpoint in the 60s is we shifted into a more postmodern, pluralistic culture. When a kid grows, little kids are egocentric. I mean, they're adorable, but they're egocentric, okay? Get to be 6 or 7 and they get more conformist. They want to fit into their class. They want to fit into their team. Get to be 13 or 14. They want to win. They want to do well on merit-based hierarchies, maybe academic, maybe sports, maybe dance. If they continue to grow, they start thinking, well, I don't just want everybody. I don't just want the people around me in my tribe or my nation to have care and rights. I want everybody to. You get more, tend to not like hierarchy and tend to want everybody to be treated equally. And if they continue to grow, they develop what's called an integral consciousness, where they see all the previous worldviews, egocentric, formist, rational, and pluralistic, as having healthy and unhealthy sides. And they support the healthy sides, don't support the unhealthy sides, and try to serve the highest good in the moment. And if you're a guy, you're serving it from who you are. Who am I? If you're not accepting who you are, it creates internal conflicts, which is basically how Freud defined neuroses. And he was pretty, that was not a bad definition. I mean, Freud completely missed personality disorders, but come on, the guy was a pioneer. Columbus thought, North America was India. I mean, but, the guy was still an incredible voyager. And one thing that Data, the pluralistic, the postmodernism, is suspicious of hierarchy and suspicious of power, particularly masculine power. A few years ago, the American Psychological Association put out guidelines for working with men and boys. This caused quite a stink. So I got the guidelines. I'm not a member of APA. I don't like to join organizations, but I'm a licensed psychologist. I follow the APA code of ethics because that's a good code of ethics. Those are standards. Those are standards. Okay, so these are guidelines. So they put out these guidelines that they amended. They'd had them for a long time. And in the guidelines, they said that there's certain aspects of traditional masculinity, denial of feelings, objectification of women, contempt for vulnerability, that are toxic. Now, the far right got a hold of this and they said, oh, toxic masculinity. By the way, toxic masculinity was never mentioned in the guidelines, but they did say these aspects are toxic. And people on the left, Dan Savage being one of them, were furious because, all right, what's the guy supposed to do? What's a boy supposed to do? Because the guidelines were great as far as they went, but they made the postmodern mistake of they did not step up and provide a vision for healthy and powerful masculine development. They didn't say, hey, look, boys want to discover their power. Sometimes they want to discover it in ultra masculine cultures like martial arts and sports, football. And those hyper masculine cultures are wonderful if you like them. I liked the hyper masculinity of a karate dojo. No excuses. I mean, I was doing an exercise once with a guy when I got my black belt, went to a black belt practice. One guy didn't hear he had hearing problems. So he didn't hear the instructions. So he knocked me out by mistake. So I fell down, right? And the instructor came and looked at me and said, don't fall down so easily. Get up. I said, and I apologized because I like that. That was, for me, those ordeals, I discovered myself. I'm an NE type 6. I was scared of those practices. I went anyway. I would have discovered my courage in those practices. Data says, yes, a guy needs to find his purpose and be true to it. A guy needs to be present. A guy needs to not whine and complain. A guy needs to be trustable. Feminine person wants a trustable masculine person. A guy needs to be true to his values. A guy needs to take responsibility for who he is. Now, when I say these things, you and probably every other man who's listening to this relaxes a little bit. Somebody with a masculine heart likes hearing this. And this is why there's so many movies where some guy gets screwed over, or, just horribly. And he goes, okay, I am going to create social justice in a way that's true to my values. And goes out and does it. Now, unfortunately, that basically is anarchy. And that's not how it really works. But it works kind of like that, in that you find something that's important, you find whatever your battle is, and then you fight it. You find whatever your challenge is and you take it. And that's very relaxing to the masculine, and feminine people like that. They want their man to be trustable. They want their man to make it safe. They want their man to be true to his values. They don't want their man to collapse in the clutch. Show me a woman who says my guy collapses into a clutch, and I'll show you a woman who doesn't have much erotic polarity in her relationship. So there's a lot of pressure to not collapse in the clutch. And if we do, we'll feel ashamed appropriately. And then learn how to not collapse in the clutch next time. Grow. We keep growing throughout our lifetime. We can do it. We can accelerate that with practices like attunement or spiritual practices, things that connect us to the other world, which I think we need. That was another thing that the APA missed on the guidelines. They didn't say a guy needs to have a connection to the sacred. That's not a bullshit connection. That's a real one. My connection to the other world is not hypothetical. It's visceral. It's here now. It's coming through me with you. It's palpable. And that's an essential part of my identity. And people need that, especially during that 15 to 20-year-old time. Lisa Miller's research was so persuasive, the U.S. Army hired her to do it with 2 million recruits that teach them how to get connected to their spiritual core. Here's the practice that she did. We can all do it for a second. Relax and sit and imagine there's a table in front of you, okay? And on the other side of the table are the best teachers that you can imagine. They don't have to be real life. It could be Obi-Wan Kenobi. It can be Buddha. It can be anybody you want. But the best teachers, Mr. Oshima, Joe Erickson, Miyamoto Musashi. I'm talking about Keith now. And imagine yourself looking at them. Look in their eyes and ask them, do you love me? And see what the expressions are on their faces. So Wes, what happens to you when you do this?
I get an initial nonverbal acceptance, that attunement in what I'm expressing. It's interesting. I see a variety. Some look a little more concerned as to why I would need to ask or assume that would be the case. Others more quickly provided that assurance through this confident gaze, I would say. All warm, I wouldn't say overly smiley. I would just say open and loving and accepting, and all very humble and simplistic, either saying verbally yes and confidently, of course, at different volumes, but not in an overbearing manner that tries to prove it or tries to convince me of it, but just almost reminds me what's always been true.
Yeah. And generally, when you do this, you feel known, loved, guided, and never alone.
That's right.
Now, here's another thing. You got a table, and on the other side of the table is your best self, your wisest self, your most powerful self, the most best you there is. Okay? And so you're looking into that guy. You're looking into his eyes, best self. And you ask him, do you love me? And just watch his face. And what happens with you when you do this, Wes?
I feel admired. I feel dignified. I feel at peace of wanting so badly to be that person and knowing that I am, and that version of me already knows he's loved. And it's challenging.
Yes.
Because I think part of it is I know he's not asking me that question. And not that I would judge him if he did, just like he's not judging me.
He doesn't need to ask that question.
Exactly. And something in me says, what are the unhealed or developed parts of me that feel the need to ask it? And how can I take those on, not with a hopeless or aimless effort to try to overcome or not ask those, but in a confident, integrated manner that says I can, because look who's sitting across the table from me.
Yes. Now, remember the model imperative?
Yeah.
So you just created a model of Wes, who is the best version of Wes to grow towards. And as you do that and connect with that, you feel known, loved, guided, and never alone. So practices like that are quite useful. I do a bunch of them every day and have for decades. I had a therapist once. She really did like it that I did so many practices. She says, "What are you doing all these practices for?" I go, "Well, look, first of all, I like how they make me feel. I want to teach my brain how to have these states. And second of all, you got to remember, all this process started for me, when I was 15 and I was psychotic. You didn't start when you were psychotic, okay? If you're psychotic, you get very interested in having a stable nervous system. I mean, now it gives me a lot of empathy for my clients who have these moments of craziness. So these practices are quite useful. Any practice that you do that serves you, that gives you this sense of connectedness, particularly spiritual law. Those practices, the more you do them, the more you activate those circuits. The more you activate those circuits, the more you myelinate them. After about 30 days of doing a practice, their stem cells in those areas divide and the daughter cells become integrative neurons. They create hardwired circuits from your frontal cortex back into your limbic area that are self-regulatory circuits. And this is how we support neural development. In fact, if you're working with personality disorders just as a therapist, you literally have to help people develop new circuits because that's what causes personality disorders. There's certain circuits people just don't have for self-observation, for instance, or different kinds of traits. And so, how do you teach people that? Well, it's messy and it's painful and it's time consuming, but we can now. And if you're a guy and you have that, you feel horrible. We do things in patterns. That's just the way the human works. In my book, Shadowlight, I suggest that we need to have a new understanding of shadow. That we have an adaptive unconscious that's taking in inputs all the time and sending us messages via impulses, feelings, stories, and so on to guide us. And it guides us to meet our needs and to reduce uncertainty and all that stuff. These are their healthy, constructive guidance, or it's destructive guidance if we feel threatened. And the more that we're aware by attunement of the constructive and destructive material that arises out of shadow, the more we can say yes to the constructive, and we can dialysize and change the destructive stuff. And if you think about it, that's how change happens. That's how personal evolution happens. And if you're a guy, you're discovering what kind of guy you are. And radical acceptance. You got to accept who you are. It was really hard. One great thing about the hippies, I was a hippie for a period of time. Being a hippie was great. We called it the counterculture because we were so sick of everything around us. We were counter everything. After a while, I realized that's kind of a bigoted position. I liked other cultures. But one thing that it was accepting of a wide diversity of how people look and how people function. So now it became more acceptable to be bisexual. It became more acceptable to discover your own way. My wife and I were polyamorous in the 70s and decided we preferred monogamy. So I didn't choose monogamy because the culture told me to. I chose it because I really tried not to do it, and I discovered that monogamy works for me. And so this is back to the hyper-individualistic Western culture. We need to find out what kind of man we are. Who are we? Let's be true to that. Now, you can't say, I'm the kind of guy that rips people off, so I'm going to be true to that. All right. So I guess you're an antisocial personality disorder, so you have other problems. Or I'm the kind of person that never treats other people like equals, and I'm always entitled. I guess you're a narcissist. That's not going to work. The person that you are is the person that you saw across the table, that best version of yourself, that wise self. If what I do is consistent with that wise self, I feel good about myself as a man and as a human being. In the Bhagavad Gita, the warrior Arjuna is going to battle, and Krishna is his charioteer. And the Bhagavad Gita is their conversation. And Arjuna asked Krishna, what's the yoga of action? And Krishna said, the yoga of action is to make everything that you think or do an expression of God. I read that in college and I went, that's pretty good, Krishna. That's a good guiding principle.
Yeah, your stat earlier, to circle back on spirituality, that there's an uptick in spiritual interest and engagement from 15 to 20 is very interesting. I reflect on my own life, and I was 18 when I had a major spiritual transformation. And going back to then also what you said about the APA and the toxic masculinity, only mentioning the negative or, what you shouldn't do. One of my favorite quotes from Father Richard Rohr says, the best critique of the bad is the practice of the better.
I love that. I love Richard Rohr.
He's amazing. And love both of them and the practices they've provided. Actually, I saw Richard Rohr was one of the people I saw across the table, by the way. And I appreciate that, and that it doesn't leave people helplessly critical. Great, you can name everything wrong, what not to do. I think most of us get it, and those who don't deserve to be disciplined for not, and then hopefully correct it and move on. But for most of us who understand, okay, great, we don't want to be toxic, what do we do? This brings in the importance of modeling what that looks like, which you've so beautifully laid out today. But one piece I want to name, I'd be curious if you could speak to, that's often missing is a spirituality. I think in today's age, it seems to be the most, in some ways, anti-spiritual propaganda and things going on as far as not supporting that. And yet we know from a recent study that for the first time in history, there are more men participating in religion and spirituality than women. And so that we have that fact, but yet we find many men who are still stereotypically closed off to spirituality and being in touch with that. I think we all know the stereotypical Karen who went out and found herself in Bali meditating upside down and decided to write about it while eating a piece of kale. And, there's that. It works. But all the men are kind of like, what does that look like? So I'm curious if you could speak to male spirituality, how that has showed up in your life and how it could commonly show up in a man's life who's a spiritual seeker.
Well, in my life, when I first started studying martial arts, I studied Shotokan karate. We did zazen before and after every practice. And when I practiced at home, I would do zazen before and after practice. I wasn't doing it for spiritual connectedness. I wanted superpowers. I mean, that's all there was to it. I wanted superpowers. But then as I became a therapist, I realized that the masculine was missing from therapy. It was a very feminine. To this day, 60% of the PhDs are in psychology are women. And so I started teaching the warrior. I started teaching the stuff that I'm talking about here. And part of that is you need to find a practice that gives you a sense of spiritual awe and then do it. In general, the way that practices work, they're easy to learn. I just taught a couple of really good ones, several today. Now, if you can get a sense of spiritual awe doing those and you do them every day, you'll expand. And after a while, you start having extraordinary experiences that feel ordinary. So I've been doing this stuff, I don't know, for 60 years now. So, my brain has been conditioned by these practices. And so I have a lot of extraordinary experiences of non-duality and unity and psychic experiences and stuff that are ordinary for me. And that's good. That gives me a sense of confidence that I'm connected to the other world. And also, it puts positive pressure on me to be true to my values. You violate your values, and whatever your connection is with spirituality weakens. Now, one thing that's happening that I find it fascinating is more people are going back to the church. Spiritual without religion was the fastest growing spiritual orientation in the last 20 years. And for the first time in 20 or 30 years, more people are going back. Why? Throughout all history, going back to the earliest times, going back to the ancestral tribes, people get together and they sing and they dance and they connect with the other world and with nature, and they feel transported. They feel spiritual awe. And there's something there that connects them with each other and connects them with the infinite and connects them with their own purpose. I have a few groups that I'm part of where I have that experience with other people. I don't think you can just do it by yourself. I mean, part of the reasons I'm sure you're doing this podcast is because you meet people like me where, we're the same tribe. In Buddhism, back in the Axial period, the three jewels of Buddhism were Buddha, the teacher, Dharma, the teaching, and Sangha, the community of the adequate around us that could share the experience and support each other in our values. Now, the danger of that, of course, the unhealthy version of that is mass formation psychosis, which you've seen recently in the world. Get a bunch of people that feel disconnected and they feel anxious and they feel irritated. And an ideology arises that said some other group is threatening us, and if we attack them, we're good. And then a leader will arise out of that, let's say a Trump type person. And as long as they're attacking the others, they feel good and they feel like they have a sacred purpose. There's a sense of the sacred associated with that movement. And this is the big critique that the Democrats have just completely whiffed on. They didn't recognize that there's a sense of spiritual urgency associated with this, that people feel like they're part of a sacred mission. Okay, well, we need to find the healthy parts of that and align with it. Because if you don't get anywhere with anybody dismissing them, how do you connect with someone? Find out what's sacred to them that you can agree with. All right, let's connect there. And to do that, you need to have your own relationship with the infinite, my belief. And so I'm a belief in doing practices and having Sangha and being true to your values and recognizing when you're doing that, you're not just yourself. A friend of mine, Bina Sharma, studies ego development. Here's an interesting thing about ego development. So you're born undifferentiated, essentially. You got 85 billion nerve cells and only 17% of them are hooked up. So, first year, around 10 or 11 months, you feel like a separate self. Wow. And that's the first time you can feel shame, interestingly. So you begin to feel more separate. Oh, and at 2 years old, I got a theory of mind. Oh, that's interesting. And then I conform to other people. I'm part of a group. And then I'm kind of more myself competing. And then if you continue to grow spiritually, stop identifying just with yourself. Maybe something larger is working through me. Maybe my individual self isn't that individual. Einstein said the illusion of our separateness. Maybe I'm connected to everything. Certainly that's what the Buddhists thought. Well, quantum physics, even the standard model of physics says, yeah, we're all made up of fields and there's theoretically no edge to a field. We're part of everything in the universe. And on some level, it's acting through us. Now, if you're a guy and you're surrendered to that, being true to your principles, you feel good about yourself as a guy. And you can develop those capacities by finding practices that give you those states and then doing them religiously. And if you find other people to do them with you, great. If you find a tradition that speaks to you, all the progressive edge of all the traditions speak to me. Progressive Catholicism, progressive Baha'is, progressive Islam, progressive Jewish teaching, like progressive Buddhism, and the fundamentalist versions of all those scare the hell out of me. Because, those fundamentalists would all see me as the other that, we've got to get rid of Keith. I'm an Indian type 6. That's a fear type, I'm very cautious of people that want to get rid of Keith. So those progressive edges of those religions, that's the future. And if you talk to the people at the top, like Keating or Rohr, put them down with a wise rabbi and a wise Buddhist and a wise Baha'i, and let's just sit around and agree with each other all day. That's how it works. It doesn't matter what the language is. In Integral, we know that language is imprecise. Felt experience is, and particularly the shared experience, the intersubjectivity. In Integral, we call that the lower left quadrant, intersubjectivity. The quality of that is something that's undefinable, qualifiable, and it's very real. And it's just as significant as CAT scan. It's just a different kind of data. And, take them all seriously. If you ever find yourself dismissing anything, you got a blind spot. And if you're a warrior, see a blind spot, your job is to find a way to not be blind there. Hey, that's a challenge. That's an ordeal that has been given you.
I appreciate that breakdown, that framework. And it seems like there is such a correlation or just correlation between practices and spirituality. Those have to go hand in hand, and
I
they
think so.
can go hand in hand. And I agree with you. I mean, for me, my spirituality became more authentic and real and integrated once I had practices. So it sounds like prayer, meditation, no agenda walks, and engaging in physical activity, whether that's some sort of exercise or a sport like martial arts, are all helpful practices. So I appreciate you mentioning those, because I think many men are wondering, what do I do? One, maybe some things you're doing are already spiritual. Are you aware of them? And two, if you are not, then that's okay. Here are some things that you can try, that you can start. So I think that's very helpful. I selfishly have about 3 or 4 more questions. I think we could keep going another few hours. But I think for today, it'd be good, just because you've given us so much packed information. I think the average guy needs some time to let it unpack. So let's pause here, and then we can agree to do a part 2 because there's other things about masculine, feminine, and other things I want to get to if you're open to it. So before we leave, where can people find your work and what you're up to?
Well, go to drkeithwitt.com, drkeithwitt.com. There's hundreds of videos. There's 10 books, hundreds of blogs. It's all free. Classes. A few years ago, I thought I'm going to give everything away. So, use it. Give me a footnote if you like. I always like a footnote. And do the practices. Find out who you are and be true to that. We have superpowers. We have superpowers as men and women. And the more we're true to our heart, the more coherent we become, the more our superpowers emerge. And we don't have superpowers just to serve ourselves. We have superpowers to serve the world and to heal it. And let's all do that.
Wise words to end on, Dr. Witt. Brother Keith, I appreciate your time, wisdom, and insight again. It was so rich, so comprehensive. We'll put everything in the show notes, and we'll plan on a round 2 soon. Thank you again, and guys, until next time.
Until next time. Much love.